Hello everyone, my name is Danica Oglesby and I'm a technical artist at Side Effects on the Side Effects Labs team. And today we're going to be creating some simple vegetation assets for use in Unreal 5 while also touching on some Houdini tools and tips, how to approach asset creation and planning, and a few optimization techniques. So specifically, I'll be walking through how I created a birch style tree using Labs tree tools, how I created a small procedural grass cluster, and how I imported these assets into Unreal, where I'll also spend a little time talking about a few material tricks I use to quickly shade my assets. But I hope that you can use these concepts that are talked about in this presentation to create the vegetation type and style that suits your own needs. So before we get into creating a tree, let me touch on briefly how the lab's tree tools work. And they work in a hierarchical structure, much like real life, which means we will start off with a trunk and we will add several generations of branches. And at the very end, we'll fill the whole tree out with leaves. And each step of this process is procedural. So from the trunk shape to the noise, to the size, to the branch placement, to the angle of the branch placement, how long everything is from the length of the trunk or from the length of the branch, all of this is controlled through this procedural system. And this system can be used to model a number of different tree shapes as long as we are staying true to the generation style and the overall style of the tree. We can make a number of different tree shapes. So here is a visual breakdown of this birch tree image I quite liked. And there's a number of different broad stroke elements here. So the ratio from the exposed trunk to the rest of the fleshed out tree, keeping the overall silhouette in mind, because trees are very recognizable by their silhouettes, and then even zooming in and analyzing the directions that the first generation of branches comes off the main trunk. And once we're satisfied with the broad stroke analysis of the tree, we can zoom in a little bit closer and analyze what's going on beneath. So here I've outlined the first, second, and third generation of branches coming off of the main trunk. And the third generation is about where our leaves will come off of. So with all of that analyzed, we'll take all these visual references and we will build a tree in Houdini. I've already made one here just to figure out what parameters I like and practice a little bit, but we will be making one from scratch. But before we make one from scratch, I'm going to capture my visual breakdown of the birch tree I showed earlier. And I'm going to be doing that with Labs, Capture, and Embed. So click this option here, and whatever box selection you make next, it will take a screenshot of that and put it in this view for you. And you can move it around, scale it. I'm going to scale it up just a little bit. And I don't need a huge detailed view. I just want to make sure we're matching shapes. So I like that. Control I, and it'll stay put for me, and I can put anything on top of it, and it just becomes part of the background. So with that there, let us now start putting down some tree nodes. So we'll first start out, I put down a trunk node first. So Labs tree trunk generator, go ahead and put that down, toggle that display on. And here is our little trunk. And for good measure, I put a tree controller on top of that. You can do this in whatever order. The tree controller just provides universal controls to the hierarchy of branches and leaves. And we will be using it a little bit. So I have my trunk here, and if I look at the tree trunk of a birch, it doesn't flare much at the bottom like it does in our model, and it's sort of the same width as much as we can see it. So I'm going to come here, and there are so many parameters. You could spend hours and hours just editing one tree, but I'm going to touch on the basics here and try and get through them fairly quickly. So here's my radius ramp, and you can see the flare here, just like the flare in our model. And we're going to bring that flare down since I'm not seeing much of that flare in the image. And it does look a bit skinnier to me, so I'm going to bring the radius down as well. Birch trees do look quite tall, so I'm going to bring the length up a bit. And if we don't like the scale at the end, we can always scale it down. What's most important to me right now is proportions. So I'm liking the length of this trunk. Maybe it could be a little bit thicker. And again, you could sit here tweaking all day long. But let's go ahead and put down our first generation of branches. So I'll start a wire off and I'll type in branch and labs tree branch generator. Put one of those down there and connect it up. And we have our first set of branches, which they do not look the way I want them to look, and we will adjust that based on our reference images. So I find that the first generation of branches to be most important when going for the look of a certain tree, unless it's like a willow tree where the last generation of branches makes it droop down. But for this first generation of branches is going to get our ratio, our silhouette, and our branch flow all in one. So I'm going to probably be spending the most time adjusting this set of branches. And I've already fiddled with the parameters a little bit. I know which ones I like already, but you pick whatever tree you want and go pause if you need to, make all the adjustments you need to. So here I'm going to set us up with a few more branches. I have about 14 in my previous example. And they're really droopy. I don't like how they're drooping. This is called gravitropism, which they're just drooping from the ground. So I'm going to go over to our tropism node, and I'm going to override that tropism. Because the tropism is built in, and you can control the global tropism through this tree controller node if you want. Or you can do it on an individual branch level, which I prefer to do. Gives me a little more control. So right now they're kind of splayed out. I would like them to be angled upwards a little bit more. So I'm going to come back to the placement tab where I spend most of my time here in this placement tab. And I'm going to angle them up just a little bit more. Now, it might take a little time to calculate. You can see it's not super speedy right now. And that's because the resolution, if we zoom in, the resolution of this tree is pretty high. And we can see the built-in noise on it. Since we're making this for games, we don't need the resolution this high. So I'm going to come to my tree controller, which controls global settings, go to resolution, and I'm going to turn this resolution up quite a bit. And so much more lower poly, much simpler to work with. And I'm going to continue adjusting my first generation of branches. So I have already tested out some of these parameters. So the branching angle branches them up quite a bit. And then let's give it some more variation, a little more organic feeling, not quite so much, maybe about 5 degrees of variation. And I really like all the ramps provided on these tools because you can get in, everything's very linear, like trunk's very linear, the branches are very linear. And so it makes sense to have all these angles where it's the angle along the length of the trunk. So here the angle is lower towards the bottom of the trunk, and as we go up and up the trunk, the angle points further and further up. And that is what our reference image looks like here, but we can see that it's a little more fanned out than what I have here. So I'm just going to make a quick little adjustment in my ramp to kind of bring the middle down a little bit so it looks more like a fan. And it's just a tiny little adjustment. And tiny little adjustments make a big difference. I do think that these branches are a little long for what we're going for. So I'm going to nudge the length down just a bit. But if we look at our branch flow, we see that these branches pointing straight up are much taller than the branches that fan out beneath them. And that's also important to give us their silhouette. So I am going to come down to this length ramp, and this length ramp is going to allow us to control the length of the branches based on their placement along the trunk. So here towards the bottom, they are a little shorter, so I am going to bring the length of the bottom branches down just a bit, not too much. And here it's starting to kind of mimic our silhouette. because we start off at the top, we come down to a point just about here, but it still curves underneath. And that's why these first branches are most important to get that silhouette looking right. I feel like the branches come down a little bit lower as far as our first image goes. So I'm going to bring this down here just a little bit. And there, I'm pretty happy with our first generation of branches here. But what I'd really like, and I've noticed this in a couple of my other examples, I would really like one branch up top to be pointing straight up. Since we are working with a limited number of branches, the shape really matters. So if we want one branch to be definitively pointing up, let's go ahead and choose that now. And I'm going to come to my tree controller because it has a really cool randomize attribute here, which will randomize a bunch of different things, and you can just click through different variations and settle on one you like. Some of these are a little too crazy for my liking, but I kind of like this one. Yeah, I kind of like this one. And we'll see what the tree looks like the more generations of branches we put on if we need to tweak anymore. So let's go ahead and put on our second generation of branches. And again, we're just going to drop down the same branch generator node. We can link as many up together as we want. Drop that down, connect both sides, and here we have our second generation of branches. And already I don't like how this is looking either. So we're going to come in and we're going to adjust these. And I find the more generation of branches I put in, the fewer attributes I have to adjust as I go along. It is really that first one that's the most important. So for this one, I chose a random amount of second generation branches to spawn on top of the first generation branches. So I chose between 8 and 12 randomly scattered branches. And the length is quite a bit longer than I like, so I'm going to bring that down to more reasonable level. And again, just making sure it matches my silhouette, making sure I like the flow of it. And we're going to adjust this angle because they are sticking straight out. I would like them to follow the parent branch a little bit more. So we're going to bring this branching angle up quite a bit more. Not too much. And then adjust the angle variation, give it a little more organic feel. And I'm feeling a bit happy with that too. So let's put down our third generation. Again, same tree branch generator. Wire up inputs and outputs together. And we have a lot of these now. The only parameter I really changed on this was the length. I find it still a little bit too long, and I want to bring that down. All right, so we have our 3 generations of branches set up. And once we put on the leaves, we'll be able to compare it more with our pictures. So now to put in leaves, we have a leaf generator tool. And it has 3 inputs because we're wired the first and second inputs from the branch generator above. And it automatically puts on leaf cards for us, UV enwrapped and everything. But if we don't want to work with leaf cards, we will look at these leaf cards in a little bit. I find the simple leaf a really cute leaf to quickly throw on your tree to get a nice estimate of what it's going to look like. And here it looks kind of sparse, not quite full. So what I like to do is I like to come over to the leaf and up the sides a little bit. It's kind of a cheap way to fill out your tree a little bit more. And I'd say we've gotten pretty close to our reference image. I really like these organic negative space areas. It matches sort of what we have in this tree here. And that kind of tells me that it's looking close to what I want. And I could spend an hour tweaking all these parameters to get what I want. But I'm pretty pleased with this. And we are going to go ahead and hop into the next part where we prepare it for Unreal. So before we bring this tree into Unreal, there's a few cleanup steps that I want to do beforehand. The first step I'm going to do is I'm going to drop down a labs tree hierarchy node. And this node is usually used with Pivot Painter, but it serves a few other functions for us, and we're not going to talk about Pivot Painter in this tutorial. So what this node does first off is it cleans up a lot of unused groups and parameters that we no longer need. So here it is before, and the tree hierarchy node cleans that up for us. The second thing it does is it assigns trunk, branch, and leaf materials separately so that when we bring this asset into Unreal, the different parts are already grouped out for us and we can quickly assign materials to the different pieces. So next, if we zoom in and look at our tree, we see that everything is made up of quads, and video game meshes are rendered in triangles. When you import an asset into Unreal, it will automatically triangulate your meshes for you. But I've had a few problems with importing certain tree models into Unreal where it wasn't able to triangulate the meshes, probably because they were so complicated. So before we bring them to Unreal, I just like to drop down a divide node that triangulates our mesh automatically for us. We zoom back in again, we see that everything is triangulated, and I haven't had a problem importing tree meshes with this technique. So before we bring this into Unreal, I want to check on the size of the tree to make sure it's appropriately sized for games for Unreal for real world units. So I'm going to change from perspective view into a front view in my viewport so we get a nice long view of this tree. And I'm going to zoom in and I see that our tree is about 23 units high. And I'm going to pretend that those units actually mean meters. And a birch tree is typically between 12 to 21 meters high. So this is pretty tall for a birch tree, and we're going to scale it down. So I'm going to drop down a transform node, and I'm going to uniformly scale it down until it reaches about 19 units. So it still makes it a taller birch tree, but above average now. Now, before we bring this into Unreal, we have to scale it up uniformly by 100 units to make sure it comes into Unreal at the appropriate size. And then after this, I am going to put down a ROP FBX output node. And here we're going to designate where we want to save our FBX mesh to. Now I have a folder already underneath my HIP directory called Geo. So I'm going to set it to Geo. And instead of out.fbx, I'm going to title this tree birch A, because we're going to be making a variation of this tree. Save to disk, and it's saved out for us. Now, if we want a few variations of this tree, it's quite easy to do if we go back up to the tree controller and we play around with the randomize parameter, and it'll randomly create a whole new tree for us. And while we're not individually altering the shape, we're just choosing a different seed that it feeds through the random generation, it does give us some natural looking variation, and it can break up the monotony of having the same model over and over again. So now that I have made my new variation from the controller, I'm going down to my ROP FBX and I am changing it from A to B so it saves another FBX of our asset. I've created this blank project in Unreal to demo our assets, and I've set up a basic folder structure already that separates our vegetation and material meshes out from each other to keep things clean. So I'm here in my meshes directory, and I'm going to navigate to where we saved our trees out, and I'm going to drag and drop them right into my project. So I'm going to create new materials on this first round, so it automatically creates the materials that we specified from the tree hierarchy node. So everything's been imported. We have our static meshes and our materials, and I'm going to go ahead and put these materials in our material folder. So let's open up one of these static meshes, and we see that our geometry is intact and our materials are already assigned to the different sections. And if you notice the high triangle count, don't worry, we will address this a little bit later. But for now, we'll focus on the materials. And for the trunk and branches, we're just going to use the same material for both, and it's going to be very simple. So I'm just going to take trunk, right-click it, and I'm going to make a material instance so we don't mess with the original material. If we look at the original material, it's just a base color parameter wired into the color. And we're not going to adjust anything here. We just want a base color. And for the base color of birches, it tends to be a sort of very light dove gray. So that's what we're going to go for here. And this is really all we're going to do. Go back to our tree asset, and I'm going to drag this instance in for branches and for the trunk. And now let's move on to the leaves. Since our leaves are flat planes, we're going to be making a special double-sided material to shade both sides. And we have to make a special material because if we look at our mesh in Houdini and we turn on the normals and we zoom way into one of the leaves, we see that the normals point from the top of the leaf upwards. And if we look at the bottom side, that there's no normals coming off of them. So the material, when it shades the underside, if we don't tell it otherwise, it thinks that the normals on the underside also point upwards. We want it to tell it to point in the opposite direction. So let's make a material that does just that. I'm going to open the leaves material, and it opens up as a simple color parameter wired into the base color. And how we are going to tell the material to point in the other direction is with the two-sided sine node. And what the two-sided sine node is, if when you have a double-sided plane, it assigns 1 to the top of the plane and -1 to the underside of the plane. And we're going to use those values to manipulate our material. So I'm going to first come to our material result and turn on two-sided to let it know that we're shading both sides. And I'm going to use our two-sided node to manipulate our normals. And I'm going to drop down a vector constant node, and we want it to point in the opposite z direction. So we're going to be multiplying our two-sided sine by 0, 0, 1 to make it 0, 0, -1 when it's shading the underside, and 0, 0, 1 when it's shading the top side. I'm going to multiply these two together and wire the result into our normal. Going to just drop down a 0 constant for metallic, specular, a 1 constant for roughness, just so it's not shiny or metallic in any way. And I'm also going to do something cool. I'm going to use this two-sided sine to assign 2 different colors based on the top side or the underside of the leaf. So to do that, I'm going to saturate the two-sided sine, which is going to clamp it from -1 to 1 to 0 to 1. And that way we can interpolate linearly, or lerp, linear interpolate. Now that I've found the correct linear interpolation, we're going to wire the saturation at the alpha, duplicate this color parameter, and wire that into our B side, and wire the results into the base color. You don't have to do all this if you don't want to. I just thought this was cool, and we already have two-sided side down, so we can make use of that. So when our value is 1, it's going to be shading the top side, which means this B parameter is going to be our top side, and our A parameter is going to be the bottom side. And this is all we need for our leaf material. Hit apply to apply your material changes in the world, and make sure you're saving often with Control-Shift-S, saving all your assets. Let's create a material instance of our leaves, and we will apply it to our birch tree. And we'll open up our instance, drag it over so we can see the material and our birch tree at the same time. And to color both sides of the leaves, Let's choose some interesting colors just to make sure it's working correctly. Pink for the bottom. Let's choose like a pale green for the top, and it's working really well. So let's see what happens if we don't switch the sign on the normals. It's a little subtle, and it's more noticeable the lower resolution the geometry is. But if we disconnect this normal line, hit apply again, you see that the leaves have now become darker and have incorrect lighting on the underside. And to prevent this, and it looks a lot worse when it's lower resolution, we're just going to leave that connected, make sure all of our normals are looking really nice. If this triangle count scares you, we're now going to address that by using a few quick optimization techniques. So we're going to come back to our tree mesh. And earlier, we dropped down the resolution of our branches and trunks while we were working. And since most detail is handled through textures and games anyway, we're going to drop down this resolution even more. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go from auto update here in the lower right hand corner, and I'm going to change it to manual just so it's not cooking my mesh while I adjust parameters. I'm going to go to my tree controller, and on my resolution tab, I'm going to bump this resolution all the way up to a little bit over 0.8. And same thing for the divisions. And the higher the resolution and the divisions, actually the lower resolution it is. It's just spacing out the number of divisions from each other. So after I've set my parameters, I'm going to go back from manual to auto update. It's going to recook my tree, and we're going to see the lower resolution here. That dropped down resolution quite a bit. But what's also adding a lot of points is our trees. Because if we zoom way in, we see that they're composed of many multiple triangles. So if we go to our singular leaf here, and I'm using space F to zoom in on my object, we see that we have 24 points and 14 polygons. Again, if we want to handle things through textures or we just don't need that, we can bring the length segments of our leaf all the way from 8 down to 3, and it makes it a much more simple shape. It's going to apply that to our mesh. And while it might not look quite as elegant anymore, it is going to bring our poly count way down. We can adjust the leaf size to kind of fill up space again. And it's super easy to save out and re-import your mesh. Just go back to the raw FBX node, save to disk. It's saving our birch B asset. So we're going to come back here, birch B tree, and we're going to re-import that. It's going to take us from 410,000 polygons, 108,000, which is still quite a bit, but we did cut quite a bit off. And now let's look at another optimization technique and see if we can get that count down even more. While we won't be implementing this in Unreal today, I wanted to show you quickly how you can optimize your mesh even more. And that's by making tree cards with a transparency mask for a leaf texture. So if we come to our tree with our normal leaf wired in, we see that we have 65,000 polygons. But if we wire in this tree card instead, and this card just has 4 points, 1 polygon, or 2 triangles, it's going to cut our polygon count down considerably. And now we're down to 25,000 polygons, so to cut about 40,000 polygons off. And if we do a quick view of this, let me turn off wireframe mode, and we zoom in, they're very flat, but they're still leaves, and it looks like a tree, and it is a common technique used to optimize vegetation. Now let's talk about this procedural grass bundle. I noticed that when I was creating trees, that the lab's simple leaf tool had adjustments I could make to it to make it resemble a blade of grass instead of a leaf. And if I lengthen it a bit here, and I go to the shape tab, and I adjust the shape ramp to make it look more like the blade of grass, that'll be a perfect starting point for us. And that's what tools are meant for. They're meant to be used how they can be used, not necessarily what they were, intended for. And so here, just adjusting the shape a bit, I've got a long, slender, stylized piece of grass. And my goal here is to scatter points, copy this geometry onto those points, and add some randomness to the scale and the rotation. So I have my blade of grass here, but I need it standing upright. I'm going to drop down a transform node, and you can use the controls here in the viewport or manually put in which number you would like for rotation. So negative 90 degrees here does stand it upright, but I do want it a little more curving out and then back in. So it's going to have to be a little more than 90 degrees to get what I want. And there we have it. So now let's create some points that we're going to scatter onto. And I want a little circular bunch of blades. So I'm going to drop down a circle, and our circle needs to be rotated so that it's sitting flat. So I'm going to drop down a transform node, and I'm going to rotate our circle by 90 degrees in the X direction. So now it's flat and we can scatter points along this disk. I'm going to increase the divisions just a little bit to get rid of the really angular look of the circle. And I'm going to scale it down by quite a bit because we don't need it that big. And now going to drop down a scatter node, which will scatter a bunch of points in our circular shape. And we don't need this many points. We're starting out with 1,000. I'm going to start out with 15. So here we have 15 points. We have our blade of grass. Let's copy this blade of grass onto all these points with a copy to points node. Our first input, if we look at it, says geometry to copy. That's our blade of grass. Target points to copy to. That's our scattered points. And we have the same blade of grass scattered on all 15 points. It's a good start, but we do need that organic randomness. And we're going to do that by taking advantage of some Houdini attributes and attribute randomized nodes. So Houdini has some attributes that are hardwired into a bunch of different systems. Houdini recognizes it as like a special parameter. So the first parameter we're going to adjust is the scale. So I'm going to drop down an attribute randomize node. And to let it know that we want to adjust scale here, instead of CD, which stands for color, we are going to write P scale, which stands for point scale, which means we want to adjust the scale of the different points. And copy to points will recognize that, and it will adjust the scale of the blades of grass, respectively. So drop down P scale, and automatically copy to points recognizes that and scales down our blades of grass, which is what we want. So we have our random P scale set, but let's fine tune this and have a little more control over what's happening. Because if we zoom in here, I see I have a tiny, tiny blade of grass, and that's a little too small for what I want. So let's adjust some of these settings in our attribute randomize. So P scale is not a three-dimensional vector. It is a scalar value with only one dimension, and it is applied uniformly. So we only need to worry about one min and one max value. So our min value is 0, and 0 scale is nothingness. So we don't want things to get quite this small. So instead of 0, I'm going to set my minimum value to 0.2, and that's going to keep me from having the really small blades of grass. And I quite like where that is. Now let's add in some random rotation to our grass. So to do that, we are going to adjust our point normals, and copy to points will recognize what direction normals are pointing in, and it will copy that transformation to the blades of grass and rotate them. So I'm going to drop down another attribute randomize node. And again, CD stands for color, which is why our grass is now all different types of colors, but instead of CD, I'm going to type in a capital N, which copy to points will recognize as the different normals and will rotate them accordingly. So they're rotated, but not quite what we want. So let's go back into our attribute randomize and see what's going on. So if I just view my points, and I turn on point normals, I can see that they're all sort of pointing up and to the right. And that's because our minimum values are all 0, and our axes go in the positive and negative direction. They don't just stop at 0. So for our min values, I'm going to go and change these all to -1. So now we've got true random rotation. But again, if we look at our blades of grass, it's still quite crazy. Not what I'm looking for. I'd like them to be mostly upright. If we look at our normals, we see what direction they're pointing in. And really, I only want rotation around the X and Z plane. I don't want a whole lot of rotation around the Y plane, which is going to make it bend forwards and backwards quite a bit. So I'm going to zero out my Y values in my normals. And we see that our normals are completely flat. And if we turn on our leaves, we see that they are completely upright, but they do have rotation about the X and Z axis. Maybe I want just a little bit of tilting in the Y direction, a little bit of back and forth, not completely bent over. So I'm going to come in and put -0.1 and 0.1 for the Y values, just to give it a little bit of rotation. Sometimes you might have a result that gets them way over. So I'm just going to come to options. I'm going to adjust the global seed until I get a result like this. So that is the main part of the grass. All we need to do now is prep it for Unreal. And to do that, I pop down a transformation node and I scale it up by 100 so that we match Unreal's units. And I'm going to put down a ROP FBX output node. And in my same geo file that I saved all my other assets in, I'm going to name it geo and vegetation grass.fbx. I'm going to click save to disk and bring it over into Unreal. So back in my Unreal file, I'm here in my geometry directory, my vegetation grass asset is here, and I'm going to drag and drop it into my meshes folder. And I'm actually not going to create any new material, so I'm going to select do not create while I import, because we're going to use the leaf material that we already have. And there's no smoothing information because Houdini doesn't have smoothing groups, but that's okay. I'm going to open up my grass here. And since we're using the same double-sided leaf asset, there's no reason we can't use the same double-sided leaf material. I'm going to create a new instance of my leaves material, and I'm just going to name it leaves grass instead. I'm going to apply that to my grass, so now it's double-sided, or shaded double-sided. And for top and bottom, it's back and front, and I'm just going to select a quick olive yellow green, and then maybe like a darker blue green so we can see the back and the front. And here we have our little stylized grass asset. So one last note I wanted to touch on is optimization. And while we won't be implementing this in Unreal, I still wanted to show you that it's available in case you wanted to tackle it yourself or find tutorials that can give a better demonstration. Because while we're happy with this grass cluster, it can start to add up in polygons, especially with vegetation, where it's meant to cover large swaths of terrain, and the poly count can increase quite quickly and quite easily. Because if we middle mouse button click on our copy to points, we see that we have 285 points or 152 polygons, and those are quadrilaterals, and so that's going to double when we turn them into triangles. So as we can see, poly count can increase quite quickly. So one common technique to preserve this look without having to sacrifice resources is to create cards or vegetation cards, texture cards, and bake the colors and attributes onto those cards. And by that, I mean these cards. So I've arranged a few grids in a star pattern, and I'm going to bake the color and make an opacity map from my grass cluster onto these cards by using Labs Maps Baker. What Labs Maps Baker does is it takes our low resolution geometry and it takes our high resolution geometry and bakes the high res details to the low res geometry. So if I turn that flag on, I see I have a diffuse map and an opacity map, so I can get these cutouts on this grass bundle. And to replicate what it might look like if you put a vertex animation material on the grass, I animated some of the points with some noise to make it look like it was blowing in the wind, just to show you how you can get quick optimization techniques done in Houdini with tools that are already provided.